Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's Bookstore, and I am joined this evening by Paul Doiron and Julia Spencer-Fleming. They are here this evening to discuss Paul's brand new book, One Last Lie, which is his 11th Mike Bowditch Mystery. This book is available from Gibson's Bookstore. Our events program is sustained by book sales and donation. If you would like a copy of the book, if you appreciate this programming, please do purchase the book from Gibson's Bookstore. I'm going to toss a link in our chat box over here. I will let you guys know that Paul has sent us signed book plates. So if there is a book of his that you would like to purchase, we will be tucking those in with every purchase. Backlist too, if you want to buy a backlist book, we're fine with that. We'll tuck a signed book plate in with that too. And Julia is popping book plates in the mail as well. So if you have a book of Julia's that you would like to purchase, she's sending signed book plates as well. So I have the purchase link for that in the sidebar. Our program is sustained by that. But this evening, we are here to discuss Paul's brand new book. Paul, Julia, thank you for joining us this evening. How are you guys tonight?
Good. Thank you for having us, Elizabeth.
Yes.
I would prefer to be there than than doing, another broadcast from my poetry nook here in our house. But
it's so. Tell me a bit about your book, Mike. About Mike's new story.
Well, so One Last Lie, as you were saying, is the 11th book in the series, and every once in a while it'll hit me that when I first started when I first published the Poacher Son and the first few books, I used to say that my dream was to write 12 books, and it seemed totally like a fantasy, and now I'm actually writing the 12th book, and I just can't believe it. I mean, it's like, how did this happen? But I know exactly how it happened, which is that I have a contract to write a book a year, and I don't get paid if I don't turn in the book. And that's a wonderful motivator, as it turns out. So yeah, One Last Lie. In this one, people will encounter some of the familiar character, sort of supporting cast from the previous books, and in this book, Mike's sort of mentor / surrogate father, Charlie Stevens, who's a retired game warden pilot, begins to sort of behave strangely, and he sort of disappears on his wife and kind of takes off with leaving just kind of a few cryptic clues, and including a note directed at Mike saying, don't come after me. And it's clearly something that has to do with Charlie's past, and it's kind of a very dark chapter in his life that Mike didn't really know anything about. And so he's sort of on Charlie's trail, kind of literally and figuratively in the book. And it's funny, the book starts in the Everglades. Mike is there doing a background check on somebody who's applied to the warden service, and it moves steadily northward, and the last part of the book takes place in the St. John River Valley, which is the northernmost part of Maine. So it goes from the southeasternmost county in Maine to the southeasternmost county in the U.S. to the northeasternmost county in the U.S. And I believe it's the only novel in existence ever to do that. But don't hold me to it.
I was gonna say, this is recorded, so
I welcome being proven wrong.
we are now on record with that.
Yes.
You say you're in the middle of writing book number 12. Is 12 going to be it, or do you?
No. Let me get this out of the way, because it's always the panicked question that occurs during the Q&A session. No, it will not be it. Among other reasons, I have my contract includes a 13th book, so we know that one's coming. And the reality is I just really enjoy writing about these characters, and am not tired of Mike Bowditch or the series or the setting or any of that. And I just, if I were, I would definitely think about changing pace, but I'm not. And so I plan on I plan on keeping going.
So we actually have a question here that wonders if you were ever a game warden.
I was not. Although I'm always flattered when anybody asks me that, because it sort of suggests that I project some confidence in the books. No, I mean, I am a registered Maine guide, and that means I have some certification and outdoorsy stuff. And I'm also just really somebody who just with a lifelong interest in the Maine outdoors. And when you read my books, I think one of the things people might think that oh, I'm just throwing in stuff that I got out of a book somewhere. And no, that's not really true. It's like if I say that a bird is singing in the month of July, in the North Woods, it's because I've heard that bird singing in the month of July in the North Woods. There's really very, very little along the lines of the outdoors that I'll go and, double check things and stuff, but that's my own experience from the outdoors. And so I bring that. It's really it's the law enforcement stuff that I have to kind of consistently research. The Warden Service, is involved in many different things, and from search and rescue to, busting illegal pot operations. That'll be, I suppose, a thing of the past soon. It's all kinds of different, activities, and a lot of that are things that I have to, to interview wardens for and do ride-alongs and that kind of thing.
So, can I jump in here, Elizabeth? Because I really wanted to talk to you about this, Paul. When this happened, I was like, oh, I'm talking to Paul tonight. It's so exciting. So you may have seen, and those of you who are watching us from the state of Maine may have seen the news story about the Freeport woman who was lost overnight. Well, she's actually a good friend of mine. She was my kids' youth leader in church. And she appears as a character in one of my books, and she was found and rescued, fortunately unharmed. She was able to walk out of the woods under her own steam by Maine game warden Chris McCabe and his canine Morgan. And I was so excited.
I know both Chris and Morgan.
But I was going to ask you, do you know them?
Yeah.
It was like, there's a lot of stuff that we are sort of talking about and thinking about and being, exposing ills in law enforcement. And it was so great to see something where it's just the good guy. I mean, there's absolutely nothing about that. There were people out there searching almost until 2 a.m. And then Chris and Morgan were up there at 5 a.m. looking for her.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the Warden Service is that it's, there's so much national conversation about law enforcement. And, the Maine Warden Service has a sort of a foot firmly in the realm of what's being discussed, but it also does all these other things that sort of fall outside of what, is being debated right now. And something like that is a great example, right? I mean, it's, nobody wants to defund search and rescue. At least I haven't heard about it.
Yeah, no, or the K9 program.
I remember when Morgan was a canine in training, not yet fully certified. Evidently, everything has worked out there.
Yeah, she looks like a very good girl, and she clearly did her job really, really well. But it was interesting because my life down here in, outside of Portland does not often intersect in any way with Maine game wardens. Not being a real outdoorsy person myself. I mean, my idea of outdoors is spending the afternoon at Maine Coastal Botanical Gardens. I like that a lot. But it was so exciting and, so gratifying, obviously, for the people who loved her that she got back safe and sound, thanks to the Maine game wardens. All right, Elizabeth, sorry.
And speaking broadly, I think we need feel-good stories, right now in general. I mean, it's part of the mood that we, and it's also, I don't know, I think there's certainly some of my books are darker than others, and some are quite dark. But I always try to throw in some comedy, and I always try to also work in some scenarios in which Mike or some of the other wardens are doing things that are, are servicey, that aren't about horrible crimes and murders and everything.
So you mentioned that you interviewed the warden that Julia just mentioned for a book. Was that for this book? What kind of different research do you do for each book?
Well, it will vary depending upon what I feel like I need to know for the story. No, actually, I met Chris. He was one of the wardens in Northwood's Law, the documentary series that started in Maine, is now in New Hampshire. And I did a ride along while they were filming an episode a number of years ago, and so I got to be in the producer's van, which was following Chris's patrol truck for a day, and I got to know him a little bit that way. And but I've done ride-alongs with other wardens and have a pretty good, I think at this stage, 11 books in, a pretty good rapport with many of the wardens in the service, and I'm friends actually with the commissioner of the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, which was that was a lucky strike there that she was promoted to that position. It was like, oh my God, somebody I'm already friendly with to answer my question. For this, you asked about this particular book. This one, I had to talk. I interviewed actually two warden investigators for this book, because it has to do with an undercover warden investigation that happened 15 years before the events of the story, and I got to look at some reports which are not generally made available, and then just talk to my other sort of contacts in the warden service and that sort of thing about how those operations are managed. And it's, as I say, every time I write a book, as the idea is forming, I begin to get a sense about what I need to know. Julie, I don't know, you must have to go through that.
Yeah, I do the same thing. And of course, we've talked about this before, that it's remarkable and very generous how people are really willing to talk with you. You email them out of the blue and you say, I'm a novelist and I'm doing, usually I give a link to my bona fides so they know that I'm not, just writing my own books in crayon or something. And people who are willing to give you information, take you places, show you what it is they do, show you the tools they work with. And it really does help. I think the more that you can do, the closer to the source. It's like an academic discipline in that regard. The closer to the source you can get, the better off you are. And I think the richer your story is for it. But so I wanted to, Elizabeth, do you have questions, or can I just leap in here because I have a question?
I have one question that I wanted to ask, and then I'm going to let you wrest it away from me. But I wanted to ask, how much of your setting informs your story, and how much does your setting become a character? in a way? And I want to ask both you and Julia that question, and then Russ it away from me.
Well, Julia, why don't you go first then with that one?
Well, this is good. It'll segue because I wanted to talk about settings too. When I started writing my series, I wrote, which I did not think was a series. I wrote what I thought was a standalone novel, and then it became a series. And I wrote out 3 pretty detailed character biographies. One was of the heroine, one was of the hero, and the other biography was of the town that they live in, because the town and the environs, I write about a very small rural town that's sort of halfway between some small cities in northeastern New York State and the Adirondack State Park. And where it is hugely important to what happens and what goes on and what sort of crimes are there, and what is committed. And one of the things that I love about my setting, and this is something that Paul has as well, and I think we both write in a genre which I like to call places where the weather can kill you. And or the outdoors, and it always adds a little extra something when you have here you've got the protagonist and the antagonist, and then you've got the environment itself, which is another type of antagonist that the hero may have to struggle with.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely how I look at it as well. And in the course of my series, I bring Mike all over the state of Maine, and some of that comes from my background. I used to be the editor-in-chief of Down East magazine for 8 years, and so I got to know the state fairly well, I'd like to think. And a couple of things sort of came out of that. One was realizing that that there were all kinds of different subcultures in Maine. That Maine, certainly nationally, internationally, is thought to be kind of one thing, and it's not. So I've tried to highlight some of the specific kind of regional differences and issues and that sort of thing. But then the other piece was that in fiction especially, I just found that the Maine I knew was not being rendered well in most of the novels that I was reading. So I really wanted to bring that Maine alive. And in one last slide, the Maine that I'm sort of showcasing is the St. John River Valley, which was founded by the Acadians, who were fleeing the British, who were in the process of deporting them to various places. Of course, many ended up in Louisiana, where they became the Cajuns. So you have this pocket of French-speaking people on the Maine-New Brunswick border, and they were pretty much left alone for a long, long time. They have a really unique, wonderful culture that's been hurt, I would say, by the hardening of the border since 9/11. But I do want to I want to throw in one more thing about character. Julia and I actually were part of a sort of a thing of discussing setting as a sort of a video project. And one of the realizations I had as I was thinking about it was that, yes, I do think that setting is a character in my books, but it also really exists in the stories to reveal character.
Yeah.
It's sort of not just window dressing. It's not there to fancy things up or to show what I know or don't, whatever. It's, I mean, one of the reasons why I chose the profession of game warden was that I wanted to have somebody who paid close attention to the natural world. And because I think that that's something, I mean, I'm speaking here primarily to a New England audience, and I think, we that's less of an issue for us maybe than it is in some other parts of the country. But people, I feel Americans are increasingly estranged from nature, and I wanted to have a protagonist who was uniquely interested and attached to it. And so when he notices things, those things have some importance and say a little bit about who he is and why he's different from some of the other wardens and different from other people his own age and that sort of thing.
Me now?
Julia, wrest it away from me. Do you have any? I do have an audience question here, though, who mentions that Paul and Julia, both of you have main characters who flaunt authority and don't like to follow the rules, and they get in trouble with their superiors regularly. Are rule followers boring? I will say, isn't that a sticker? Well-behaved women rarely make and a well-behaved protagonist is not terrifically I mean, I think that it can be done interestingly, but they are not so much with the rule following. So why do you make them defiant?
Well, so I'll leap in on that one. First of all, as you say, people who break the rules are more interesting. I mean, there's a reason it's sort of the cliche, you know, in the cop TV drama, it's like, you know, God damn it, Laszlo, you got to stop breaking all the rules. And, you know, you can't tell me what to do, Captain. It's because, you know, it is sort of, it ups the interest level as opposed to somebody who does everything the way it's supposed to. But also, it's really important when you're talking about crime fiction to have your protagonist, I think, getting into trouble. And, you know, by not doing things the right way or waiting until it's prudent. And I have one of my lead characters is a very impetuous person. And I would also say that Mike Bowditch, in a lot of ways, is a very, you know, go with the gut kind of guy. And it leads them into more trouble. And the more trouble you get your protagonist into, the more interesting the book becomes.
Absolutely. And you know, for me, a lot of it came out of the fact that when I wrote The Poacher's Son, it, you know, I didn't think of it necessarily as a standalone novel, but you know, it was very much about this guy, young guy who was quite damaged, and you know, he's in denial about a lot of things, principally in the book about who his father really is as a man, and as that, you know, I began contemplating how to turn that into multiple books. I realized that I couldn't turn on a dime with him, that I had to sort of keep going, you know, that hopefully he would mature over the course of the series, but he would always remain that guy at some level. And so that, you know, I kind of, without meaning to, I created a character who's had to be sort of rebellious ever since, and to be consistent, right? I think the other piece of it is, I mean, I too like books in which the character is, I mean, I believe that a character doesn't have to be, you know, a rule breaker to be interesting in crime fiction or other things. And in fact, it can be kind of a cop-out, right? That, you know, it sort of creates false drama too. But ultimately, I think what you're looking for as a reader is some level of competence. That's the quality that you respond to, is that even if the character is sort of reckless and doing all, you know, that there's still some level of expertise, you know, and in the end, he or she can, you know, is gonna pull it out and, you know, and save the day. And so I think that's sort of where those things overlap, you know, is the the conformity and the, you know, and the competence and that kind of thing.
Is that fun to write? Do you like to put your characters into scrapes? Does that, or I guess, do you have favorite parts to write of a story, and do you have favorite parts of a character? Those might not be the same things. Because I feel like sometimes the parts that you enjoy the most about the character are not the easiest parts to write.
I think the parts that are easiest for me it's the dialogue. If I'm writing sections of dialogue, I go really fast. The parts, I'm trying to think what I would say is about the character is, I'm not sure. I don't think I have anything profound to say about that. I will say that in general, I find transitions to be difficult. Switching scenes and that sort of thing. That's an area where it always takes a little extra effort. Julia, what do you?
I was just thinking of I won't drop names, but a well-known and well-established mystery author whose books I have very much enjoyed, but who insists when her characters go from point A to point B, taking you on they go out the door and they get in the car and then they drive and then they turn left and then they turn right and I think her books would be about a quarter shorter if she just said, you know, we're going to talk to the suspect. He hung up the phone. They knocked on the door at the house, you know, the suspect's house. So, like Paul, yeah, absolutely. Dialogue, I could write dialogue for days. And sometimes it gets a little indulgent, you know, when you've got two people that like go well together. And there have been times when I've been, you know, they're quipping away and I think, wait a minute, this is not really moving the story or the character or anything forward. The two hardest things for me are, ironically, since I'm sort of known for setting and location, is writing setting. You know, getting it right without revealing the details that are going to tell something. You know, as Paul said, you said they tell you about the character. You know, what a character notices, what they don't notice. So getting those details right that set the stage, that give the reader a picture in his or her mind, that reveals something about the character, but does not turn into this long, boring, you know, travelogue of where everybody is and what they do. And the other thing I find really hard to do is figuring out the mystery at the end, because I never know what's going to happen. And I get about 2/3 of the way through, and then I go, oh, crap, now I have to figure out who done it.
I wanted to circle back to something you said about the character we were talking about with the characters. So Michael Conley, who's a writer I respect quite a lot and enjoy a lot, I've heard him say that every time he starts a book, and of course all his books or almost all of his books are set in Los Angeles, he reads this paragraph, actually it's more than, I think it's a few paragraphs from Raymond Chandler's novel, The Little Sister. And it's just Philip Marlowe driving around Los Angeles, observing the night. And it's true. It's like, it is absolutely magnificent. It's like, I lived briefly in Los Angeles and it's still true, you know, that what he's capturing there. It's like, so I can see why Conley does read that every time, like, because it gets him in the vibe, you know. It's like, yeah, this is what I'm trying to do.
I think that would depress me. I mean, reading somebody who's like that, I don't want to read anybody who's a better writer than I am. Like, oh, just why do I bother?
Well, to circle back to what you just mentioned, Julia, are you guys a pantser or are you plotters? Or are you, do you plot out your story before you begin, or do you figure it out on the last page you suddenly realize the butler did it?
Yeah, I know we're both pantsers. We both are organic writers, because we've talked about this before. And I know for me, I start out usually with a theme rather than a specific, idea for a murder, or often for me, a lot of times actually the crime comes last. It's kind of, I'm trying to capture an idea, a theme. I have something I want to say about the characters, and then I remember that I write mysteries, so somebody's got to die. And so then I have to figure out how that's going to work its way in.
That almost seems like the crime is a framing device.
In a way it is. In a way, I view the crime as kind of the engine that's, I've got, everybody is gotten into the vehicle, and then it's the crime that gets it started and keeps moving it down the road until we get to the end. But really the interesting stuff, the most interesting stuff, is what's going on inside the vehicle. It's not the engine per se. You need to hit all those beats and make sure you're playing fair with the readers and that they trace it back there. But I think certainly increasingly, as I write more books, I start to feel more and more like I'm writing novels with mysteries in them instead of mysteries. Although, there's still mysteries, and I love it, and I'm not planning on ever leaving crime fiction.
What about you, Paul? How much of a framework do you start with?
Well, it took me a little while to kind of figure out. Well, I mean, as is the case with everything, you do learn how to write a novel. The more of them you write, or at least you hope you do. But I learned that the best way for me to start a book is ask myself a few questions. Sort of, I always say to myself, well, okay, where is Mike Bowditch to begin this book? What's going on in his life? What is he dealing with personally, professionally? What kind of, and sort of then kind of think about what those conflicts are. And then I always want to know what the setting is. I want to know the month of the year, because again, the warden's job changes from month to month. And then I come up with a crime that somehow brings to the surface whatever that conflict is that Mike is wrestling with, which makes it sound a little bit cold and calculating when it's actually much more sort of organic than that. It's like one of those things where I wake up in the middle of the night saying, oh, that's what I'm trying to write about. So yeah, it's really, I oftentimes, I know what the crime is. I know what, I think I know who did it. I don't know that I've ever really changed the villain at the end, but there are things, yeah. I mean, I sort of let the story, I follow where the story leads, and expect that what that's going to mean is I'm going to have a lot of cleanup to do in my edits. My second draft is where the real work is, in terms of making it feel like an actual book.
So for the both of you then, if you're both pantsers, how long does it take you to write that first manuscript?
6 years. Oh, it's not so long.
No, it isn't long. I mean, that's the thing. I always say about that, with my first book, people ask me like, how long did it take you to write your first book? And I'm like, yeah, I think it actually took me 6 years to write my first book. And I'm like, the world wasn't sitting around waiting for the poacher's son, there was no pressure on me to kind of get that thing done.
Yeah.
Now I'm on a book a year contract, and it doesn't really turn out to be a book a year, because you're also working on edits of the book that you just turned in for several months after you turn it in. I mean, you get a copy edit back, you get proofreading back, and if you've moved on too soon, and ignore that stuff, it's at your peril, because you're going to hear about all the mistakes you made. You'll hear about them anyway, but yeah, there's nothing worse than having the book come out and saying, oh, I really should have given this a harder look. I suppose my first drafts usually are written in about 5 months. And
That's
then,
pretty good.
you know, the revisions are the bulk of the rest.
So I'm going to take this moment to remind our audience at home that we do have books available for your purchase, that our events program is sustained by book sales, and that both Paul and Julia have mailed in book plates for inclusion with your purchase from Gibson's Bookstore. We do ship, we do curbside pickup. I will put a link into the description and chat. And let's move on to some audience questions while we perhaps go back to what you just mentioned about, excuse me, my cat has noticed that I am in my living room and a part of this event now. You mentioned that if you don't take your time, then you end up making mistakes. So we have a question here that says, do you keep journals of all the plants, animals, weather conditions in specific main places, or do you have an amazing memory? So those are the kind of details that you have to look up. And then a question for Julia as well. How did you develop your character of Clare?
Well, in terms of I like to think I have a pretty good memory. I take a lot of notes to which I don't refer. I'm like somebody who's writing notes, and then I realize I never went back and looked at those notes, you know. But I will always, you know, double check, and I have people that I show things to, principally my wife, who is world-class birder and you know, and knows a lot about wildflowers and butterflies and dragonflies and that sort of thing, and helps me with those, you know, with those details. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that.
You know what? It's the writing down that helps you to remember, so you don't actually need to look at notes. That is a proven technique. Trust me, as somebody who's gotten 3 kids through college, I've heard all about it. But you know, you write down the notes as you're doing it, and then you don't necessarily have to go back to it.
I think that's called the tactile learning style.
Yeah.
That you have the tactile once your hand creates the notes. I always took notes as well by hand, because if I type it, it's not the same. My brain doesn't understand it until it has experienced it.
Yeah.
And then we also have another question, actually, Paul. Where did Mike's dog/wolf come from?
Oh, well, yeah. It came from 2 places. One is it sort of came out of nowhere, in the sense that I did not, that it first appears as a wolf dog that's mostly wolf, that Mike encounters, and it had been named by a previous owner, Shadow. The idea originated from a place in New Hampshire, actually, just across the border from Maine, that I visited with some friends years ago. It was a wolf refuge up in the White Mountains, and this guy living kind of way off the, well, it wasn't off the grid exactly, but some friends said to us, we were staying with them, and they said, you want to go see this wolf refuge, and you won't believe it. And we drove up, and, you know, it's dirt roads, and really it felt like middle of nowhere. And we began, I mean, it was amazing. We began to hear howls, and, you know, we ended up seeing like ravens circling, and ravens and wolves have, you know, historically, they have kind of a symbiotic relationship. And these aren't even necessarily all full-blooded wolves. They're wolf dogs. And yet the ravens sort of recognized them as, for what they were. And this place was just crazy. I mean, you had these 10-acre pens, and each of them had these little mini packs of wolf dogs. And some of them looked like, you know, like a scary black wolf. And there was one that came right over to the fencing, who, honest to God, looked like a full whatever collie. And it was like the dog was looking at me like, I'm falsely imprisoned. Can't you see I'm a collie? I don't belong in this place. So, you know, it's funny. I mean, at the time, I wasn't this was before I started writing the series and stuff. And it's funny how that kind of circled back, and it just, I was writing Widowmaker, and somehow that whole experience just kind of came back. And then I created that sort of canine character, and people really responded to him. And it was a case of people's responses sort of making me think about, well, maybe there's something to do with him, more to do with him than just, leave him in one book.
It's all sort of grist for the mill. You have these, as an author, you have these experiences that might be, a decade or 2 decades ago. And then you're writing and you reach out your hand and boom, there it is. It falls right in there. And you use it. In my last book before my most recent one, Through the Evil Days, so that came out in 2013, but what the setting is actually the great ice storm of 98, which traumatized me to such a degree that not only did I put it in a series book, but I also have a whole standalone thriller that I want to write about it, because that was a traumatic event. So I wanted to there was somebody who wanted to ask about how I came up with Clare,
Develop your character.
Develop Clare. So and basically I came up with Clare as a priest because when I was starting to really read crime fiction, prepping to write, I actually started writing science fiction, and did not do a good job at science fiction. And I wrote a good half of a novel, which I then workshopped and realized that I had actually just written a murder mystery that happened to be set on a space station. So, thought maybe I ought to turn to murder. And so I was reading crime fiction novels because I was not a big mystery reader, and I needed to learn what I was going to do. And the thing that I really liked the most were more amateur sleuths, people who were not necessarily law enforcement professionals, but who had a realistic, sort of a psychologically believable reason for getting involved with a crime. So I was really responding to books with, lawyer protagonists and reporter protagonists. And I was at the time a lawyer, and the last thing I wanted to do was spend the rest of my day with fictional lawyers. So that was out, and I didn't want to have to learn about reporting or anything, but I'm a lifelong Episcopalian, so I thought I can do that. I know that milieu, I can write about it. So I started with that, and then her military background came out of the fact that, as Paul said, one of the really one of the best things I think for readers, one of the things they really want to see is competence. And so I thought, what sort of experience, if I wanted to be a very action adventure-y kind of person, and there's a surprising amount of action adventure in my books, what sort of background is she going to have that's going to make her capable of doing that, of being her own hero and rescuing herself, and sometimes rescuing the chief of police. And I thought, okay, well, she's got a military background, which is also something that I knew because I come from a military family. My father was military, my late husband was, my son is currently serving in the Navy. So I'm really well steeped in that environment, if it were. And can I address one other thing that I saw in the chat, Elizabeth?
Sure.
Which is, because I think this might disappear and I might not get it. Mary Lynn, you have an Episcopal church in Virginia, and I do not know how to pronounce your last name, and I apologize for that, in Arlington. So if you can send me an email, my email is juliaspencer-fleming@gmail.com, no hyphen, just one word. Then I would be happy to talk about Zooming for your book club. But I think the chat disappears. I don't think there's a way to save it. So I wanted to get that out.
But Mary Lynn also had another question. Why did you decide to end things between Hadley and Flynn? And she thought they were going to be the new Clare and Russ. And so, but she did also want to know, why was the idea of writing about an Episcopal priest intriguing to you? But I think you just answered that part.
Yeah. So, I love romance in my mysteries, and Paul does too, maybe not quite as floridly romantic as mine, but there's a lot of stuff that's in there about Mike's, love life or lack thereof, and or complications thereof. But as you will see in both of our novels, as the bard says, the course of true love never does run smooth. In real life, if people meet and they fall for each other and they go out on a bunch of dates and they talk and then they realize, this is it. Let's be together for the rest of our lives. And it's great. That's what we all want. In a book that is so boring, it's like, we want tension and drama and conflict and people having to either resist their worst impulses or try and find their best impulses. So I will have, and I will continue to have romantic relationships, and Kevin and Hadley's story is definitely not done, but they're never going to be smooth and easy.
So Lynn wants to know, for both Paul and Julia, what does your writing day look like? Do you write all day, every day? Where do you write? Take us through your day as an author.
I have an actual office that I go to, I commute to. I live in Camden, Maine, and my office is on the Rockland waterfront, kind of the working waterfront. I have a tiny harbor view. I have to look across a boatyard to see it, but I found that it was really important for me to have a place I went to, not to write at home. I just couldn't. I mean, I can do it. It's just not ideal for me. But I like kind of getting myself into a writing mode and then getting there. And of course, I still kind of procrastinate before I get started. But I feel like I'm good for most of my book. I'm good for about 4 hours of quality writing. Those 4 hours may be kind of spread out over 6 hours or plus. And there have been occasions where I've written for many hours, probably because my deadline was looming. But that's sort of the writing piece of it. There's also, of course, the other stuff that one ends up doing, the research trips and things, which are complicated now. But that's my writing.
And what about you, Julia? What does the day in the write of Julia, the writer
Spencer-Fleming, do? So I'm actually talking to you from my office, and I just leaned back and took a picture. So it's not as shadowy in real life. And then this is what you see from my front. Although normally my laptop is not stacked up on a pile of SAT workbooks. So I actually have a nice view of a big mountain laurel, and I get to see the blossoms and birds nest in there. So it's very attractive and nature-y. And I get lots and lots of natural light coming through the windows here. So my goal is to work writing in the morning. And I've actually recently been trying to adjust that to doing it first. For a while, I fell into this not great habit where I would start off on my social media and figure, I'll knock that out of the way. I have a blog that I have to comment on every day, and I put it up on Twitter, and then I'm going to tweet somebody else's book. And then, see, Paul's laughing because he knows how this goes. Yes. And then I was like, okay, and I'm going to slap something up on Facebook and get a picture on not Pinterest, on Instagram, and boom, I'll get it all done in 45 minutes. So 2.5 hours later, I'm like reading some story that, you know, I traced down on Facebook or something. I was like, ah. So I've decided I really just need to not, I just heard something that said, and I think this is so important when you are working for yourself. You know, when you're a writer, it's not like you've got somebody peering over your shoulder. You don't have, I mean, you know, my late husband used to say, is that book ever going to get done? But, you know, other than that, really, until you're up close to your deadline, your agent and your editor aren't, you know, calling you up every Friday and wanting a report for it. So I just heard something that said that you really need to learn to discern what's important from what's urgent, which can be very difficult when everything you're doing is on the computer, because a lot of this stuff, you know, emails, having to, you know, do social media, it feels urgent because it's right that day and you got to get it done. But the important thing is to get the work done, is to get the writing done.
Okay, so is there any books that you want to tell people about, perhaps to take us out? Is there any books that you have recently read that you really enjoyed that maybe recently came out and got the short stick by a pandemic?
Well, unfortunately, most books get the short stick. Well, far too many good ones do. So a mutual friend of Julia and myself, Sarah Stewart Taylor, who lives in Vermont, has a book out called The Mountains Wild,
Yeah.
which is an Irish mystery and the beginning of a new series, I believe. I think she's been pretty open about that. And that's one she and I will be appearing down the line at the Northshire Bookstore, which is, there's two of them at least. And we're doing a Zoom event together. And so that's kind of fun because she was somebody that my wife knew at college. Small world.
Didn't know that. Really?
Yeah.
Huh. It is a small world. Well, it's a small New England world, that's for sure.
Yeah, true.
So I've got a couple of things. So I was mentioning, we were talking before this, and I was mentioning I have on the way ordered from my local independent, one of my local independents, S.A. Crosby's BLACKTOP Wasteland. I think we deserved, that was the title, which got a lot of buzz. Crime fiction with this sort of classic idea of the guy who was a felon, and then he got out and he's trying to go straight and he's getting sucked back into it. And it got terrific buzz and was bought in a big preempt, which in publishing means some publishers were extremely excited for the chance of getting that story out. So that's going to be good. And also coming up, I've already had a chance to read it, but everybody listening will get a chance. Just later this month, my good friend Jen McKinley, who does both romance and mysteries, is kind of mixing it up with women's fiction, which ties into Sarah Stewart Taylor's, because a third of her book, which is called Paris is Always a Good Idea, is set in Ireland. And it's about a woman in her 30s whose life has sort of fallen to pieces, which all of us can now, you know, recognize. And she decides that the way she's going to straighten it out is by retracing where she did parts of Europe that she lived in when she was a college student, and trying to sort of recreate those experiences, which actually, interestingly, is also something that happens in Sarah Stewart Taylor's book, The Mountains Wild. So both of those, you know, get Paris is Always a Good Idea and The Mountains Wild, and read them and compare them, and just read them so you can get out of your own house for a while.
Yeah, it's about the amount of traveling we're going to be doing here. So
that's true.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the both of you for joining us this evening. I will mention one last time that the books are available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we are including signed book plates with purchases of both Paul and Julia's books from Gibson's Bookstore. We are recording this event this evening, so keep an eye out for that. And we will be posting it to our social media and to our YouTube page. And if you have anybody who you can think of that might have enjoyed this program this evening, feel free to forward the link to them and get more eyes on these books, because this is a hard time for book discoverability right now. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks,
Good
everybody.
night.
Good night.